This is another iROAR podcast.
Ybor City is also in the process of gentrification. So I think that's important. And so, the chickens almost serve as proxy for eviction of other quote unquote noisy neighbors, like very human animal presences in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a way, I think in the process of gentrification, chicken residents and non-chicken residents are connected in terms of who is making the noise and who is not part of the harmonious neighborhood.
Welcome back to The Animal Turn, everyone. This is season 4, episode 7. We're almost there. We're getting near the end. It's been an incredible season so far. And in today's episode, we're talking about a pretty cool concept, the Republic of Noise. Now, I knew I wanted to talk a bit about noise in this season because noise is kind of one of those sounds we all think of, like noise and silence, and it just seems like an obvious concept to talk about. But when I came across the concept of Republic of Noise in Jeremy Gordon's paper, I just knew that I needed to talk to him. And this builds on really well from the last episode where we spoke to Eva Mayer, who was already kind of thinking a bit about the politics of noise. And I think Jeremy Gordon's concept here, Republic of Noise, gives us some interesting different interventions. So Ava, in her episode, she spoke a lot about kind of the embodied experiences and how to pay attention to bodies. And in this episode with Jeremy Gordon today, we do speak a bit about bodies. We speak about beaks and feet and voices and vocalizations. And we focus a lot on chickens. But before I tell you any more, obviously I'm getting very excited, let me tell you a bit about Jeremy. So Jeremy Gordon is an assistant professor of communication studies at Gonzaga University, where he studies and teaches environmental communication, environmental studies, and critical animal studies. He is, what he says, obsessed with questions of how ecological relations are rhetorically animated by both human and more than human messmates. He is specifically interested in how urban ecologies and feral spaces are entangled with one another and create a variety of encounters. Jeremy has co-edited a special volume on animal rhetoric for the Rhetoric Society Quarterly, and he is currently, what he says, enchanted by the kinning with feral chickens in Tampa, Florida's Ybor City. And this isn't the first time we've spoken about chickens on this podcast. Actually, I'm starting to accrue a pretty cool collection of chicken-orientated episodes, between Patrice Jones speaking of chickens as survivors and Catherine Oliver speaking about urban metabolisms. And now here we've got Jeremy Gordon speaking about a Republic of Noise. And of course, Jeremy is speaking a lot about chickens in this episode, but I think the concept of Republic of Noise can really stretch far beyond chickens and also potentially far beyond the urban. We have a really interesting, I think, dynamic conversation where we're quite obviously riffing off one another and enjoying chatting with each other. So I hope that you kind of build on and get some of that energy too and feel inspired to write using this concept as well. Before we get into everything, I just wanted to say thank you once again to the sponsors, to Animals and Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics A.P.P.L.E for sponsoring this podcast, as well as to SAP Lab and the Sonic Arts Studio for sponsoring this season. All right, everybody, happy listening. Hi, Jeremy. Welcome to the Animal Turn podcast.
Oh, thank you very much. This is an absolute pleasure, a humbling pleasure to be on the podcast.
Yeah, we were just speaking in the green room that I'm also super excited that you were aware of the podcast and that you've listened to the podcast before.
It's a little funky transition from fan to guest.
Well, I think you're a great guest to have right now because I just read your paper on, actually I've read it a couple of times now on, where you talk about the Republic of Noise, which of course we're going to be speaking a bit about today. But I actually think you sit at a really neat intersection of some of the ideas that have come up in the season so far, soundscape, sound ecologies. This comes up in your paper. Music, you definitely use a lot of like music words and music ideas, resonance, etc. in your writing. And of course, Martin Ulrich spoke quite a bit about that. And you won't yet be aware of this, but the next episode that's going to be released is with Eva Mayer, where I speak about voice. And
Nice.
you also talk about rhetoric and voice. So I think there's a lot of cool stuff with regards to your work. So I think you're coming at just the right time in the season,
That's
which is
perfect.
really
That's great to
exciting.
hear.
Yeah. But as you know, as someone who listens to the podcast, before we delve into Republic of Noise, I like to hear a bit about my guests. So could you tell me a little bit about you and how you came to be interested in what's a fairly niche area of interest, right? How chickens sound in a city. So take it away.
That's that's a long story. I won't go back too far. I've always been, not always, I think I've always, growing up, I was growing up in a rural Nevada space. So I grew up in central Nevada in the US. And one of my first jobs, I was 12, 13, was trapping prairie dogs or gophers on an alfalfa farm. And so I won't go into too much detail about what that involves, but needless to say that being out in the fields, both listening to prairie dogs and gophers, quote unquote, speak to each other, and then also call to each other during the during the process of me trapping and quote unquote taking care of the prairie dogs. That I think was a pretty profound experience in terms of thinking about the relationship between humans and animals in agricultural spaces. And so then fast forwarding to my time in Florida, I lived in Florida, Tampa, for a couple years, and didn't know too much about Tampa before moving there, and happened to go to Ybor City, which is a Cuban influenced neighborhood in Tampa. And I was sitting, it was a fairly common occurrence for me to drive into Ybor, walk up and down 7th Avenue, which is the primary avenue or the primary walkway in Ybor City. It's where all the tourism happens. There's cigar rolling that still takes place there, coffee roasting. So the smells, the sights, and the sounds are really visceral, especially in the summer, where Florida humidity, it's almost as if all of these things like seep and stick to your body and the space.
Okay.
So I fell in love with Ybor City really fast, really quickly. But one day, sitting at the Blind Tiger Cafe, I was grading, I was sipping espresso, and I was watching these feral urban chickens, the Ybor City chickens, stand at the crosswalk with their more than human animal counterparts, waiting for the light to change so they could use the crosswalk and go across the street. And so I watched this happen, and my initial response was kind of pithy. The old joke came to mind, why do chickens cross the road? And then that pithy thought was quickly replaced by a much deeper reflection. Well, maybe because they have places to go and things to do, right? This is their street. So the more I got interested in the chickens, I just became really curious about who they were, how they ended up in Ybor City, and that, of course, not to give away too much here at the beginning, but that got me really into this exploration of how the Ybor City chickens have become part of the neighborhood, but also central to a struggle over Ybor City's public ecology. So they're at the center of a controversy. I would say that those, between my past experiences with agriculture and how that influenced my attention to chickens in urban space, I would say those two moments really kind of bookmark how I came to this particular project.
And it's fascinating. I mean, hearing you speak now as well as how you write, you really are able to kind of convey a sensory experience. Like even as you were talking, I could smell the coffee and I could hear the rolling of the cigars, and you kind of bring that attentiveness of the place into focus, and the fact that you saw chickens as contributing to that sense of place is, I think, really profound. But were you always asking animal? So before this kind of encounter with chickens, were you asking animal studies related questions or sound related questions? What's your kind of scholarly background? What did anything
Mm-hmm.
prime you, or what primed you to actually see the significance of the moment that chickens have things to do and places to go?
That's such a wonderful question. I would say I came to, I was inspired and enchanted by critical animal studies fairly late in my graduate school experience. I
Hmm.
think it emerged in, I was randomly, kind of randomly chosen to be a graduate assistant for an environmental communication class, an undergraduate environmental communication class. And so, being part of that experience, I realized that environmental communication was, that's where I wanted to be. That's where I wanted to study and teach. And that was emphasized or amplified by a small reading group full of wonderful weirdos, my friends and colleagues in grad school. We put together informal reading groups, and that really tried to push the limits of what rhetoric is, what rhetorical studies could be.
Hmm.
And so we focused a lot on rhetoric as embodied, as energetic, as relational in all kinds of different ways that pushed against maybe a more traditional model of rhetoric, which is about, quote unquote, the good man speaking well. And so I think all of those things came together to inspire this move towards thinking about not only rhetoric as sound or the sonic dimensions of rhetoric and how we amplify that, but also how that really becomes central for understanding and taking part in quote unquote the environment.
Hmm. Yeah, so this is something I've often kind of struggled with or thought about, is kind of the tensions between writing about environment and about animals.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that one of my supervisors, Laura Cameron, she's an environmental historian, and she's written a fair deal about like sound and sound ecologies herself. And yet, even in my own kind of dapplings in thinking about sound and environment, I've often found animals lacking somehow. Somehow, even though animals are a really important part of thinking about environments, sometimes I've felt as though what they're trying to say or how they are in those places is sometimes opaque, which is really kind of interesting. And I think this brings us kind of well to the concept for today, which is Republic of Noise. And before getting into kind of the whole thing of Republic of Noise, perhaps we could sit a little bit with the idea of noise and what is noise, because I think noise is quite political as well. So maybe you could start us off with just walking through how you think about noise as a useful concept for animal studies folks.
Yeah. Um, Maybe a way into this would be through maybe talking a little bit more about the controversy surrounding the chickens in Ybor City. That's kind of a sideways, getting into the question of noise a little sideways. So,
Okay.
because in Ybor City, there is right now the chickens are protected by laws and ordinances because they're feral, so they're considered wildfowl.
Hmm.
Um, but there are residents now who um, want to evict the chickens because they make too much noise, or at least that's one of the reasons that's often given in city council meetings.
Hmm.
So you might hear, like, if you go to any city council meeting, you might hear things like, well, they're making it hard to sleep. They're they're um, they're disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood. And so noise becomes, the way that I think about those reasons is, well, it seems like noise is separate from what it means to live in a good community or a harmonious community. So noise almost punctures this sense of order, of productivity and efficiency, of sense. So there seems to be this connection between harmony and making sense.
Yeah.
And so the way that people talk about noise typically is, well, it's nonsense, it's disorder, it's excessive, it's inefficient. And so noise then becomes not only a reason for eviction, but it's also constructed and maintained by all of these ideologies about who and what is worth listening to, and assumptions of how a place should sound. And so for this, I'm really thinking about a communication studies scholar named Jennifer Stover, who describes what's called the listening ear. And the listening ear is a concept that helps us take into account all of how habits of listening accrue over time. So how do certain ideologies and assumptions filter the way that I hear something like the chickens in an urban space? So noise, I think, tends to be heard as something negative, excess, and thus it needs to be excised in favor of harmony. So at least in this context, that's how I'm thinking about noise.
That's really useful. And I think, because I do think that I've spoken about it, I think, earlier in the season, where there was a shift and change in terms of thinking about what noises or what sounds were appropriate in cities at particular moments in time, right? I think it's fairly reasonable to assume that chickens and roosters were sounding in most cities for most of cities' existence. They're small animals who humans have used throughout history. And it's arguably their sounds have been in cities for longer periods of time than they've been outside of cities. So there was a time in which the sound of roosters and the sounds of chickens were welcomed, or maybe not even welcomed, just not thought about. They just were there. But then obviously you kind of see in the early 20th century, ordinances come into place. So even the city I'm looking at, the roosters all of a sudden became a problem. It almost seemed like overnight roosters became a problem, and you had the Board of Health saying, wait, how do we, and I like that you used the word evict. I hadn't thought of that before, but how do we banish these birds from the city? And all of these kinds of municipal government bodies trying to figure out how they can get rid of birds in a legal way, which is just, it's really fascinating when you think about it. And eventually a noise ordinance was the way they did it. They realized they couldn't just outright banish the birds, but they could regulate noise. And those regulations had really material impacts for roosters in the city. But yet here you've got Yobo City, which is a special kind of city here because the birds are protected by an ordinance as opposed to being banished by one, which I think is fascinating for two reasons. One, it points to the fact that cities can be different, and there are many cities today that are this way. I think most cities in the world do have chicken residents and rooster residents. It's only a very handful of small developed cities that are absent, where these noises don't permeate the soundscape, right? And sometimes when I have these conversations, I kind of forget that actually it's kind of weird that you don't hear roosters and chickens in the city, actually, if you think about it. Anyway, I'm rambling. I think that it's interesting here, though, how regulation and ordinances are used to manage chicken and rooster populations. And I think that this maybe speaks a bit to the republic part of your concept here. So it's republic of noise. So here, if I understand you correctly, noise, we're kind of managing expectations and societal kind of hopes as well. But republic, am I correct in understanding that republic is speaking more to like these governance things, or what are we talking about when we say republic of noise?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'll just back up for a minute, because there's also because what I mean, what you were talking about just made me think about how um, Ybor cities also in the process of gentrification. So I think that's important. And so, the chickens almost serve as proxy for eviction of other quote unquote noisy neighbors, like very human animal presences in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a way, um, I think in the process of gentrification, um, chicken residents and non-chicken residents are connected in terms of who is making the noise and who is not part of the harmonious neighborhood. But in addition to that, I was also thinking about how harmony, when it's situated opposite noise, also helps to maintain these binaries between human and animal, nature, culture, urban, rural, um, voice, noise, or speech and noise.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the proposals for what to do with the chickens are related to, well, we just need to put them back where they belong, which is typically framed as back on the farm or as poultry.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this, if noise seems to be also this marker or this binary that constructs the chicken as already out of place. Can't be urban chicken, so we'll just put it back on the farm without even considering, well, no, these chickens have been here a long time. They've adopted the rules of the road. They're not farm chickens. So they are part of this republic. And so this is a segue into this republic idea. So when I'm thinking about a republic of noise, I'm thinking about how, and I might go about this sideways as well, with pro-chicken rhetoric and activism in Ybor City, and how they're trying to form this larger political, cultural body that wants to develop a different way of listening and a different way of relating, where they actually foster noise as something not to be negated, but noise is something that actually is central to a rabble of voices that come together that shape the atmosphere of what it means to exist in this space. So this Republic of Noise is made up of members of what's called the Ybor Chicken Society, a nonprofit organization that advocates for, that serves as ambassadors for chickens, and tries to educate not only tourists and other members of the community, but also newer residents who are moving in. And so the volunteers for the Ybor Chicken Society with the chickens have, in the way that they walk together, in the way that they move and communicate in embodied ways in this space, have created this almost a different valuation of what it means to be noisy, if that makes sense. So the Republic of Noise is less a governing political body and more of a loose chorus of footsteps that thinks about, well, if harmony forecloses a community, because harmony assumes a perfect sounding place that's finished. The Republic of Noise is actually a recognition of, well, Ybor City is an ongoing imperfect attempt to sound out relationships and becoming together. So uh, I,
I like that. I think so. So if
yeah.
I understand you correctly, it's leaning more towards the messy side of things. Sometimes we construe, I think, nature, or like I was speaking about earlier, environmental history as kind of, as you say here, you tend towards harmony, but I think we often tend towards thinking about silence or purity or perfection, whereas noise here
Mhm.
is messy and not easily defined and not harmonious, but that doesn't make it not beautiful. Noise can be beautiful. You can
Yeah.
sound together. You can find new openings. And again, here, music, you said chorus, you can find a way to sing together, or you can find ways to, I guess, pick up a beat or a rhythm and move in a different direction. So, so
Yeah.
here, if I'm understanding you, you're meaning that through noising together in the same locality, in the same place, which is Yobo City, chickens and humans, and arguably many of the other residents who make up the soundscape, are making a republic. It's not that this is
Mhm.
it's political to recognize that these sounds are not just nothing. They're not out there. They together, even in the ways in which they rub up against one another, make the city what the city is.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you put that. It makes that was beautiful. In a messy way. It amplifies the city as multi-species resonance more than a map.
Mhm.
So, vibes, expenditure and circulation of energy, um, that makes room for excess, not as nonsense, right? Excess is this noise is not nonsense. It's very much right what defines Ybor City, and Ybor City is inherently a loud place anyway. It's
Yeah.
I hear this from students. I heard this from students. It's where all the best clubs are. It's where all of the loudest music
You're not going to all these
go.
best clubs.
I will neither admit nor deny club hopping with chickens in Ybor City. But it's a loud space anyway, and so it's almost
Mhm.
as if there's this possibility that comes with embracing noise in this urban ecology, as a way to puncture or rupture this desire for a closed off and finished community. So I think about it more as a this clamor is at the heart of what it means to relate, and it's this ongoing, constant, back and
Mm.
forth negotiation, struggle, um, multi-species collaboration to make Ybor what it is and what it should be, um, which I think then perhaps starts to get at these binaries between nature, culture, urban, rural, human,
Yeah.
animal.
And I like the fact that you're focusing on the oral components here. So we tend to, in thinking of the unwanted and how the unwanted also constitute space, kind of those that we try to disavow and we push away somehow through that very act of saying, we don't want you here, seem to, I was speaking earlier with my husband, Oliver, about raccoons in Toronto. Torontonians speak about raccoons all the time. They're notorious. They're thrifty. They figure out how to open up like trash cans that the government's invested millions into figuring out.
Yeah.
And these bandits just know what they're doing. They trouble the ideas that we have. Yet I think they make us think of Toronto as Toronto somehow. Even in trying to push those raccoons out, I don't think they're like they're the urban animal of the city. Toronto wouldn't be the same without those animals there. And I think to kind of sanitize the space of their presence would be to lose something. Um,
Mm.
but I still wonder though about the use of noise, because it does have so many negative
Yeah.
connotations, so many ideas that to be noisy is to be out of place and to almost call for some sort of governance, right? It already comes with some preconceived ideas about the extent to which you belong or don't belong. So then I'm like, because I really like noise. Noise calls attention. Just because it's noisy to me doesn't mean it's noisy to someone else. So I think it calls attention to some power imbalances. But do you ever worry that noise might not be helping with this this project of thinking of Ybor City as a multi-species place?
Yeah, that is a difficult question. And part of me, I'm thinking in a couple of different ways. So noise certainly has negative connotation, and I think that depends a lot on habits of listening. So in a republic of noise, maybe there's a sense that, well, noise challenges me to reflect on my listening ear. So again, like my habits of listening, how certain ideologies and identities inform the way that I hear things and make judgments about who and what is worth listening to. And so just, just the presence of noise maybe presses me to reflect on my own attachments to certain sounds over others. And I'm also thinking about democratic politics as noisy, as inherently about a cacophony of voices coming together to make decisions, but not rational. So this isn't the perfect speech situation. So I think amplifying noise also challenges me to rethink, well, the phrase is often, this is what democracy looks like.
Yeah.
And so what if we shift that phrase to, well, this is what democracy sounds like. Democracy should be noisy. It shouldn't be, well, maybe there's, times and places, different contexts, but democracy at its heart is about discord, dissent, being noisy, raising voices. And so there's a sense that embracing noise is also this attempt in this context to also embrace the inherent messy cacophony that is democracy, I think.
That's really cool. So so noise allows me to, at a personal level, stop and think, okay, I've heard something that's bothered me, and to stop and realize, why did that bother me, and to actually reflect on the sounds and spaces that jar me, because sometimes that's a product of unequal power dynamics. So sometimes I might have a sound that I hate, but I need to think, why do I hate that sound? And I think earlier in the season, someone spoke about kind of the unpleasant sound of seagulls. And I was like, wow, I love seagulls because of my own history. So there, I think that speaks to kind of your own individual histories and how stopping to find out what irritates you, how that was shaped. And then on the other hand, I really like what you're saying there about democracy being discordant. Like, there are different voices and different sounds and different ideas, and they don't always have to be harmonious for it to actually be what politics looks like. Actually, if everything is sounding the same and everything is in harmony, then maybe voices are actually being stifled, ideas are being stifled. So that's really yeah, I think that's super powerful in thinking about sound and animals and how we can kind of mobilize their voices in a political way, and taking seriously the ways in which they sound places. But I think you also talk about noise in a fascinating way, in that you focus not only on the sounds the birds make, in terms of their vocal capacities, but on the sounds that their bodies make in general. You spend a lot of time in the paper speaking about feet and steps, and I love the idea of talking about chickens as pedestrians as opposed to poultry, because that just shifts the whole narrative. That shifts the way in which we think about them. So could you maybe talk us through that a little bit, kind of the embodied understanding of noise and I guess pedestrian making?
Yeah, this is probably my most favorite thing to talk about, actually, is the feet. because, and I think this is why I love Michel Desserteau, in the way that he describes walking rhetoric and pedestrian speech acts, and trying to bridge this notion of speech and walking. So the way that Desserteau describes walking rhetoric is in the very steps that we take in any space, we can make things appear, make things disappear, foreground some things, background other things. We create meaning through these different paths, ways to go. We can change the dimension of a place with footsteps. And of course, Desserteau is talking really about everyday acts of resistance. So how do ordinary everyday acts of walking rhetoric or pedestrian speech acts enunciate a different direction, provide detours around power structures, or throughways into cracks of oppressive, unjust systems of power. And so as I was sitting there watching the chickens walk across the road, and there were moments where I started walking with the chickens through the city, and the volunteers for the Ybor Chicken Society also walk with chickens through farmers markets, advocating for the chickens and making sure they're not stepped on or kicked out. So there's this sense that these pedestrian speech acts are trying to enunciate a different form of belonging, while scratching along the pavement with talons. And so I really think about this walking rhetoric as a really embodied form of communication that tries to connect speech and advocacy to, well, if we're going to enunciate a city together or a space together, then we should probably get into the habits of paying attention to each other's steps and walking together in this space.
That's incredible. And I think there's a long history of seeing how disenfranchised groups have taken to space to lay claim, to get heard politically and to be taken seriously. I, of course, grew up in South Africa, and there's a long history of resistance against apartheid by occupying space, by walking in spaces that were defined as white. And this could very well be a death sentence. Like, it was really and truly a profound thing to walk in a space where you were not allowed. So I think that that's really powerful in terms of thinking about the spaces that animals occupy and who is allowed to decide where they're allowed to occupy. And of course, this is not to equivocate the kind of history of apartheid South Africa here, but just to think about how numerous scholars are thinking through kind of how space is used in these political ways. And I like that the idea of the chickens walking through the market, and that they have, you started the interview saying they have places to go and things to do, that these chickens have a long history. They know these spaces, and they might have different agendas. They might not be going to the market to buy chicken. They are going to the market to find grain, or to find shelter, or just, I don't know, maybe that's where they meet their friends. They've got a different agenda. So the space that we have, our preconceived ideas of that space shift when we start to try and think about what are they doing in that space, which is really cool. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, though, is something I think, and thinking about the Republic of Noise, is to not collapse all chicken experiences as being uniform and the same. So you spoke earlier about Yoruba chickens having a long history, and they're intergenerational, and this is how they know their city. But these aren't the only chickens that are in Yoruba. You speak a lot about immigrant chickens. Could you maybe talk us through how this speaks to a Republic of Noise?
Yeah, I think this goes to the complicated. I think this goes to a really complicated ways that Ybor is constructed as inclusive and exclusive, because we have in Ybor there are the Ybor city chickens, and they're protected. They have more protection both by advocates and legal codes than quote unquote the chickens who were dropped off. And so there has been an increase over the last few years of chickens who have been abandoned in the city, in the neighborhood. And these could be backyard chickens. They could be chickens that were taken up as pets, chickens who were used for prize fighting. And part of the reason is because, well, there is a history of chickens being taken care of in Ybor City. So we have these chickens who have been abandoned, and the Ybor City chickens. And so certainly here's this tension between the Ybor City chickens, through their walking, in their enunciations, have proclaimed and have advocated for their belonging, and activists have advocated for their belonging. But what happens to these quote unquote other chickens? Are they now part of the Republic of Noise? And what the Ybor City Chicken Society has started to do is to expand the Republic. So they recognize, and I think we have to recognize that the chickens who have been abandoned or found their way into Ybor City more recently aren't necessarily versed in the atmospheres, the movements, and the reverberations of Ybor City yet. It doesn't mean that they can't, it's just hasn't happened yet. And so members of the Ybor Chicken Society recognize this. Like, they wouldn't be able to flourish in this space yet. And so they've created what's called the Ybor City Micro Sanctuary. And this is a place where I don't know if I would call it, it's a refuge. It's an urban refuge for these chickens who have arrived for various reasons. And it's a way to almost, I don't want to say acclimate, but certainly kind of, let's join the Republic of Noise, but we need some refuge first before there's like before there's a refuge space, an in-between space.
What it makes me think of, and something Patrice Jones mentioned in an earlier season, is sometimes we forget that chickens are birds. We've come to think of chickens as kind of this monolithic group, and we forget that they're birds and they've got particular bird things that they would like to do. But here, I think what you've done is also kind of show how particular groups of chickens have very different histories. Ybor chickens have a different history and a way in which they've come to constitute Ybor than the immigrant chickens, and both histories are valid. When you were talking about a sanctuary there, it just made me think, how many people would second guess kind of the establishments of a sanctuary for songbirds, or for, that other birds kind of that have been prized because their sounds arguably have been prized, their music is prized, and their presence in the city is viewed as welcome. If an urban sanctuary, an urban space were to be cornered off for them, I wonder to what extent people would raise an eyebrow. But then you think about a sanctuary for chickens in the city, it's that in itself is kind of doing what you said earlier. It's taking up space, which is actually pretty neat.
Yeah, and it's also expanded. I think it also embraces this idea that a community in the Republic of Noise, the community is always in process of becoming. It's never finished. And so we have to, figure this out. And it's going to be messy, and it's going to be imperfect, and it's going to be noisy, but that's okay, because that's part of what it means to be here and to take part in sounding out a community. So I think this, these tensions are being addressed in really imperfect but yet caring ways that tries to pay attention to well, yeah, like there are different individual chickens with individual needs and desires and movements, but also groups of chickens who need and we should listen to differently, because flourishing might mean something different. And so under the Republic of Noise, I think that's all taken into account. So, and this question actually came up during a recent lecture I gave on this topic here on campus. One of the students asked about, well, what about backyard chickens? Are they part of this, political formation, this political cultural formation? And I wasn't quite sure how to answer that question, because the backyard chickens are also different. They have different relationships with more than human animals, and human animals, they're in a different space, but yet part of Ybor City. So that raises even more complicated questions about, who is part of this Republic of Noise, and are there actually boundaries to it?
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because even as you were saying, kind of becoming with, and this is something I struggle with in my own kind of writing and thinking, is it's one, at what point do any sort of hard and fast rules get applied to a Republic of Noise? So I think it's really generative and powerful to recognize that these sounds and embodiment of animals in particular places make those places what they are, and that those places, in line with ecology and ecological thinking, shift and change over time, and that we produce in both our togetherness and our frictions that place. So I'm with you there. But then the Republic part, or the political part, says to me that there should possibly be some lines in the sand drawn, that there are some becomings that we potentially want to prevent. There are some becomings that we say are actually not ethically appropriate or problematic. And maybe this is just another sounding board that someone gets to stand up and say, you spoke about the colonel in the paper, and he was killed. So what are the rules of engagement in a Republic of Noise? What ethical, and who gets to determine those? And these are big questions. I don't expect you to have the answers to them, but it's just kind of in terms of thinking through. It's something I struggle with a little bit, with becoming with kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, the kind of the limits of the Republic. And to be honest, I haven't, because I've been so focused on noise and this Republic of Noise as resistance, as a way to sound out an alternative way of hearing, listening, and being. I don't think I've spent enough time reflecting on the possible limits, but certainly the rules of engagement. I think maybe I can riff a little about, Desserteau, with Desserteau, and thinking about what it means to walk, to create a space with walking rhetoric as a collective. And so right, and openness and practice of walking, broadly defined, could be one of those, I guess, rules of engagement, or one of those habits necessary to promote this Republic, along with maybe being comfortable with discord and clamor. But beyond that, I don't think I've thought enough about the limit cases.
Yeah, the reason, I think walking as a methodology and as a way of engagement is really, I think walking and food as animal studies scholars are actually interesting points to think through. Eating and walking, and how they constitute space, and how both humans and a variety of animals, we all do these things. We walk, or we fly, or we swim. We have mobility, and we eat. So I think that's really important. But in thinking about uncomfortable noises here, you said you've listened to some of the previous episodes. So a story that stuck with me so far is obviously the story Mickey Valley kind of presents with him. A moment for him where he was just trying to record the sound of pigs being slaughtered, and that actually, and maybe this proves the Republic of Noise here. It's not necessarily something to refute it, but that sound, he realized that he was participating in something awful, and that sound struck him in the most emotive way. So there was noise there. That noise actually cut to the heart of him, and maybe that is the Republic of Noise. But then I think it's thinking through the boundaries. So is this sorry, and I'm thinking with you here.
Yeah.
What does that do? Is it the Republic of Noise is the ability to get people to stop and act, or is it an acceptance of the ever evolving sounds? And what sounds don't we want to be in that noise? Do we want the squeals of pigs, for example? So
I think that is wow. So again, riffing now. So the Republic of Noise.
It's all in the spirit of riffing.
I'm trying to use more auditory metaphors to challenge the visual metaphors that are highlighted and foregrounded in a lot of the ways that I talk already.
Let's drum it out. Let's let's I don't know, I'm not good with this. Wait, you wrote lots of them. Let's reverberate. Let's vibe.
I like vibe. Amplify. Let's amplify some stuff.
Yeah, let's amplify. That's cool. I'm going to start saying that just to random people. Let's amplify.
I love it. Well, I'm thinking about, okay, so if I center the Ybor Chicken Society, volunteers, activists, their relationships with certain chickens, it becomes clear to me that there are limits to this particular Republic of Noise. That doesn't mean that those limits can't change and shift over time, depending on context. But there are, and this is, I think that I think volunteers and the people I've talked to in the organization would agree that, there are definitely voices, sounds, presences that we should not necessarily promote in this republic. Whether that's, I'm thinking about barking dogs that also scare chickens. That's probably not life affirming in this sense. There's also cars that, while most cars on 7th Avenue will stop and let chickens cross the road, there are other autos that they may stop or slow down, but they will rev engines as a way to get or honk to get the chickens to hurry up or to show dissatisfaction or impatience. And I would argue that that's another sound that shouldn't be part of this Republic of Noise. Like it doesn't partake in the democratic. It doesn't try to sound out the community. It tries to control the community via sound. And maybe that's one of the ways that I would differentiate control and management versus participation and sounding out relations.
Yeah, that's really useful. So to pass them apart instead of collapsing them all into one another. That's and I guess it depends from whose point of view, right? Like if you are walking with dogs versus walking with chickens, you might have different priorities. And like you said, making noise about them and finding, maybe there's a dawn chorus to cities. Maybe there is a but now I'm trying to take us back to harmony. Wait, Claudia, have you learned nothing? I'm trying to take us back to maybe there's a way in which these sounds can, but yeah, Okay, I think this has been really helpful in terms of noise as being something that we can use as a useful concept to thinking about animals, not only in terms of how they're positioned in human politics and governance structures, but also as something that problematizes their place, but potentially provides useful avenues for thinking about how that happened, I think.
Yeah.
So I think this is really, really useful and powerful. And I love all the use of sound metaphors and music throughout there. But we're
Yeah.
quickly running out of time. So
Okay.
maybe now we could just switch to talking a bit about your quote if you've got it with you.
I'm torn between two quotes,
You're
and I
welcome
was
to read
gonna.
them both if you like. A
Oh,
lot of
okay,
people do.
okay. I appreciate that. Because I was also thinking about we were talking a little bit about writing and style
Mm,
earlier, and so I was trying to be attentive to not only um, my own writing, but whose writing has some bounce to it, whose
yeah.
writing is poetic, and you can almost hear it in addition to seeing the words on the page. So the first quote is from David Abram, um, who and the book is The Spell of the Sensuous. So David Abram writes a lot about uh, these poetic encounters with environments and strange relationships that emerge, and really tries to feature the embodied visceral forms of communication. So this is from the chapter The Flesh of Language. And it starts, so he's trying to really, pun intended, flesh out a different way of thinking about this thing we call speech. If language is always in its depth, physically and sensorily resonant, that it can never be definitively separated from the evident expressiveness of birdsong or the evocative howl of a wolf late at night, the chorus of frogs gurgling in unison at the edge of the pond, the snarl of a wildcat as it springs upon its prey, or the distant honking of Canadian geese veering south for the winter. All reverberate with affective, gestural significance. The same significance that vibrates through our own conversations and soliloquies, moving us at times to tears, or to anger, or to intellectual insights we could never have anticipated. Language as a bodily phenomenon accrues to all expressive bodies, not just to the human. Our own speaking, then, does not set us outside of the animate landscape, but, whether or not we are aware of it, inscribes us more fully in its chattering, whispering, soundful depth. So I love that
That's
quote.
beautiful. Goodness.
Yeah.
That's writing done well.
So there's the sense that humans' proclamations to own speech from the very beginning is fallible because we only borrow speech from ecology. And that completely shifted my way of thinking about what it means to communicate. And then the second quote is a little less. The second quote, and you can include this or not, it's totally up to you, is a little less joyful. Another scholar who inspires me is Deborah Bird Rose. The book Wild Dog Dreaming, Love and Extinction, specifically the chapter, What if the Angel of History Were a Dog? So Rose is reflecting on Ben Hameen's ruminations on the Angel of History painting, which becomes a metaphor for looking back on the catastrophe and the violence and the wreckage of modernity. And so Rose asks, what if the angel of history were a dog? And this is the answer. If the angel of history were a dog, she would be in the world, in relationship, in communication, and she would be calling out, Let us say that this is so. Let us continue with the idea that the world is real and that others communicate and that we too are called into connection. This angel is howling now because her fellow human creatures have lost themselves in the labyrinths of their own death world and seem not to know how to find their way out. She is howling with grief over the deaths and the torture and the relentlessness of it all. And she is calling out in search, trying to pull us and others back into connectivity. Come back, she calls. Come back to the world of the living.
Wow. I love that. Both of them. I mean, both of them kind of show sound and voice, but not, something Ava said was, it's not this idea of giving voice, but actually of just recognizing that animals voice and animals have history and animals have place. And that even our very idea of that voice as being noise says something maybe more about us than about them. But really, yeah, she writes beautifully. I think just incredible to kind of think about the histories and the different spaces that they occupy. And I like the idea of like thinking about history written by other animals. What events would they include? What kind of, we always tell the same historical events. In school in South Africa, I was taught primarily about World War I, World War II, but very little about African histories, which I think is actually, this says something about the politics of the world, and the hegemony is what histories we are taught, what histories we are told. Yeah. So what would happen if we told the big history of chickens, right?
Yeah. And what would it mean? I love both of those quotes because it asks me a really hard question. What does it really mean to listen? At the end of like ultimately, who and what do I listen for? Who and what do I deem worth listening to? And how do I develop the practices and habits to develop a different attunement to these presences that don't fit or that are deemed out of place? I think for me, those two quotes really emphasize that idea as well.
Yeah. And possibly even how to listen for those that, silent is not the right word, but those that get lost. I constantly think back to Paula Akari when she said, so many animals are just part of the wallpaper of our lives. And I think there are animals who demand to be listened to because they lay claim to space. They take the space as their own, and we have to almost respond, whether through our policies or our actions. And I think the ethics of the ways we respond is, open for debate. But there are many other animals who kind of are invisible, who we don't really think about. How do we start to train our ears and our minds to thinking about a variety of animals? Yeah. How do we hear those that don't sound? I don't know. Yeah. Like how do I get empathy for the fish in the ocean and the whales and the, it's interesting to think through for sure.
Yeah. How do I let go of my own desire for harmony?
Yeah.
Well?
I mean, I saw that throughout this episode, and I kept wanting to kind of push the noise or the republic of noise into an idea of all of the noises. How do we get to a place where all the noises we make are kind of viewed as just like a dawn chorus type thing, that we all operate at different frequencies and that we all have our own space to make noise. But maybe kind of gearing for this type of equilibrium is not the right way to go about it. Maybe there is this kind of embracing of the messy. Yeah.
And we didn't get to talk about this, but there's also, the literal shit on the ground that become controversial for the chickens because they just leave their feces all over. And so there's this desire to clean that up. But what, could we imagine just living with it and being okay with it? And I don't know the answer to that question.
That opens up a whole bunch of other questions, right? Like there's a reason why we started removing shit as shit gets into waterways, and it creates other sorts of problems that are real problems and tend to obviously impact, they impact very specific populations, human populations in cities, and this is often shaped by class dynamics and stuff. So whose lives that shit impacts is very different to who is necessarily asking for that poop to be cleaned
Yeah.
or not. And these are not easy questions to be fixed, but I do think being okay with a bit more messiness and being aware of what the limits of that messiness
Mm-hmm.
should be or could be is, yeah, it's not easy, but it's definitely something that we've only started, I think, to try and grapple with, is how do we navigate this? And I think that is what makes this political, is it's not just an easy answer. It's not an easy fix. It is
Yeah.
navigating different desires and interests, right?
It's I
And
love Donna Haraway's notion of messmates. And so whenever I talk about, not whenever, a lot of times when I talk about human more than human animal relations, usually I just refer to us as messmates. Like we make messes together, one way or another.
we do make messes together, but sometimes humans make messes with or using animals as well. So we both make messes, but sometimes the ways in which we make messes are differently visible, I suppose, or differently legitimized, right? So like the ways in which we make a mess, we've created policies that enable us to make a mess, that enable us to put pollution in water, and we've created contra policies to try and figure out our trash and our waste as well. But we've legitimized our waste in many ways. But the mess that other animals make, maybe depending on the space it's in, it's more legitimate or less legitimate. You know, a deer that poops in a forest is allowed to poop in the forest, and we all say, oh, it's a beautiful part of ecology. But a dog that poops on a sidewalk this could be, you know, a big thing of strife for the community, and kind of sidewalk politics. So I like the idea of messmates, but I think it's very place dependent. You need to kind of who is allowed to mess where, who is allowed to be dirty when, is significant, right? Oh, okay. Well, obviously, this has been a really fruitful concept. I like that we started with noise and kind of the usefulness of noise, and unpacking how a place comes to be thought of, and kind of the political potential of censoring noise for specific animals, species, or even populations of that species. That's really, really useful. Is there anything else you want to add before we start rounding up or anything like that?
I don't think so. As long as you think that was okay and you got some stuff you can use.
I think we got plenty of games. Okay, so before
it too messy?
No, I don't think it was too messy. The podcast episodes are here for... I mean, the way I view them is it's half me trying to figure out what this concept is and chiming about half-baked ideas I have and hoping that we can do something together. And I think we've done that, and that it's useful for listeners to kind of think of new concepts, right? Like you've got so many useful concepts in this paper that we could have, I think, spent tons of time on. I mean, Republic of Noise, rhetoric, A.P.P.L.E politics. I absolutely love A.P.P.L.E politics. Pedestrian speech acts. I think there's a lot here, and the idea of politics as being auditory, and I encourage everyone to head out and read this paper, and to maybe think a bit about noise and pollution and dirt, and how we've kind of got sanitized ideas of what sounds are okay. But while we're wrapping up, perhaps you want to tell us a bit about what you're working on now, and if people are interested in learning more about your work or want to get in touch with you about these chickens, or maybe some of your methods as well, because this is a great paper for methods. Kind of, you use photography, you use walking. So if people want to get in touch with you about any of these things, how do they do that?
Yeah, certainly. I'll welcome anyone who wants to email to set up coffees or drinks, happy hours. More than welcome to do that. I am a huge proponent of collaboration and collective intellectual work. I'm not versed in social media, so I don't have a Twitter or an Instagram or anything like that. Probably should, but in the future, so looking ahead, I'm currently in the process of hoping to start a documentary on the Ybor City chickens.
Wow.
Which
amazing.
Is a little intimidating, but I think it will be a nice way to maybe combine all these methods. The walking, the photography, the audio recording, a little bit of ethnography, a little bit of rhetorical analysis. So that's in the works. And then I've also been thinking a lot about where I'm currently residing in Spokane, Washington, in the U.S., and the feral politics here. So currently there are the South Hill feral turkeys that are starting to become another presence at the heart of a controversy over residency and eviction, inclusion and exclusion. So I'm probably going to ground myself a little bit more here in Spokane. And I think this is emerging or evolving into a larger project about feral birds and urban ecology.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ideas you've brought up here with noise and also with foul politics, or actually any sort of politics, you could, any city, I imagine, any place, even a rural place, you start to pay attention and attentiveness to it, and you'll unpack those stories. So that's really, really exciting. I look forward to kind of, and like starting to compare how those politics manifest in different cities in different ways. Will be really kind of some of Jennifer Robinson's ideas of comparative cities and ordinary cities, kind of thinking through elsewhere and stuff. I think that's really cool. And I love that you're doing a documentary. That's wild. And I think what a great moment. I think about all of these movies that are coming out now, like Space Dogs and Stray and Gunda and now Cow, and they're all starting to position animals, and often taken for granted animals, as like these protagonists, which is really, I think it's a really transformative device and way of kind of engaging with people in a way that maybe gets away from some of the more, I don't know, different. It's a different way of telling a story. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but it's really exciting.
The charismatic creature. So, ask this question to students is, because some of them were asking like, well, why chickens? As if, and my pithy response was, well, if we were talking about dogs or dolphins, would you ask that same question? Well, no, because it's just chickens. I'm like, so what would happen if, the chicken became the poster animal for climate catastrophe? How would that influence environmental justice activism in specific places? Does it ground environmental justice differently, given how industrial agriculture is attached to unjust labor and toxic flows that like you said, impact marginalized communities? So we got into a discussion about, well, which are the creatures, which animals should we really be foregrounding as the protagonist for climate catastrophe?
No, it's I mean, like I do work with cows, and I think cows have very quickly become a poster child for climate change, but not in the same way that a polar bear has, right? A polar bear is viewed as kind of a victim of climate change, someone or populations that have been deeply impacted by our decisions, whereas cows have kind of become these poster children in that they're seen as villains and contributors to climate change without necessarily accounting for our relationships. And then I would love to kind of see polar bears and cows come together and see how there is a connection here. Like if you're having a conversation about the Arctic and you're not talking about agriculture, you're missing a big portion of what's happening here, the ecologies and the politics. Ooh.
If not a documentary, I'm thinking about Judith Jack Halberstam's Pixarville notion where, kids' films have these radical anti-capitalist, socialist, utopian political visions. And so what would happen, if we develop this, kids cartoon animated films that feature polar bears, cows, chickens, like the animals that quote unquote don't get to go together, that becomes the medium in addition to a documentary. That could be kind of cool.
I could definitely do a whole episode just on these films, because I think there is a lot of the right type of stuff, the good stuff mentioned in these Disney films, and the ways in which, but at the same time you watch the movie and you step outside and there's Dory the fish to buy. So it's it's like, come on,
yep,
come on, what are you doing to me? So it's that would really be an interesting kind of thinking through aesthetics and kind of moralizing, but also the material actions of these industries. It's fascinating. Gosh, I think I could talk to you for ages, but I'm gonna stop it there. Okay. Thank you so much for being a fantastic guest. It was really a joy to have you on the show. Hi Hannah, welcome back once again to the Animal Turn. I believe today we're going to be speaking about what's going to be one of the coolest named animals ever, pistol shrimps.
Pistol shrimps, yes. Pistol shrimps and sonic warfare is my title of this this highlight. Let's just start with shrimp in general. So certain kinds of shrimp, of which pistol shrimp are a family, these kind of snapping shrimps, are collectively some of the loudest beings in the ocean. So in certain places in the world, if you kind of have ever been lucky enough to snorkel or go scuba diving, you'll be very familiar with this sound of shrimp. So they have these kind of snapping or popping sounds on the ocean floor. And this kind of fact of shrimp being really noisy was memorialized in a sound artist called Jana Windren. She has a recording album called The Noisiest Guys on the Planet, which records a kind of crustacean called a decapoda. And they're a kind of very integral part of the ocean soundscape in a way that a passing ship might be as well. And they're just really loud for such a small species, and they kind of come together. So some shrimp use this sound making capability for their survival, and that's where our friends the pistol shrimp come in. So they capture their food and warn off competition and predators through sound. So they have this amazing ability where they kind of cock their claws open and clamp them shut really quickly in the direction of the prey. And this creates a bubble, and this bubble pops, creating a sound that's so loud that it stuns that prey, and then the pistol shrimp capture them. And so that's why they're called pistol shrimp.
Wait. Before you continue, how big is a pistol shrimp here? Like how big am I?
Well, you're thinking small. You're thinking small kind of crustacean that might live under a rock at the bottom of the ocean. Like nothing.
The size of my pinky.
3 to 5 centimeters. So you're probably about right that they're about the size of your pinky, or smaller even.
Okay. And there's a shrimp who snaps closed his claws, creates a bubble, and stuns who he's trying to catch, or who's trying to catch him.
So he's trying to catch it. And then they might also do this to kind of warn off predators as well, or kind of sexual competition. But the bubble bursts, and it's the sound. And there's also a heating element of it, that the kind of, there's so much energy in it that it's so hot. And this can be damaging too. So it's this real power. And that has been, I don't know if you've ever seen the film Project Power. I hadn't heard about it until I started researching this. So it's this film where everyone kind of has these superpowers. Spoiler alert, I don't know. And the lead character, played by Jamie Foxx, and all the powers are something that an animal also has. And so the lead character, Jamie Foxx, his superhero character has the powers of the pistol shrimp. So he can kind of make these kind of hot sonic booms to kind of stun people in the same way that a pistol shrimp would. But having said all that, I think it's maybe important not to like sensationalize this. I think in the way that, because they're called a pistol shrimp and they're kind of considered, you know, the most dangerous or most noisy or whatever animals on a planet, we've kind of militarized them in that sense. You know, they're also just beings kind of hanging out, surviving on the ocean floor, and it's just kind of have this really cool power. One of their claws is substantially bigger than the other, and the big one is kind of that pistol one with these kind of superhero-like abilities. These snapping shrimp do make such a huge sonic impact on this kind of soundscape of the ocean. I think that's really cool.
Well, I mean, when you go underwater, you hear that crackling, right? You hear that crackling, and that I knew that was a lot of like shrimp and smaller animals in the. But I had no idea. Like I'm reading here that a pistol shrimp, the bigger claw, it snaps at a speed of 97 kilometers per hour.
That's
97
wild.
kilometers per hour. I mean, that is unbelievably fast. And then it says, so you said it's really loud. It says it's 210 decibels, and the average gun is 150 decibels. And a lion's roar is about 114 decibels. So it's not just loud, it's substantially louder than sounds that we would consider, you know, loud in our worlds, which is just really cool. Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for that wonderful animal highlight.
No problem. I'm glad to have introduced the pistol shrimp to you.
Thank you once again to Jeremy for being such a wonderful and dynamic guest, to Hannah for the animal highlight. Also, as always, a thank you to Jeremy John for the logo, and to Gordon Clark for the bed music, and to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, for sponsoring the podcast, as well as SAP Lab and the Sonic Arts Studio for sponsoring the season. If you'd like to find out more about these sponsors, I've got tons of information about them up on the website. You just have to go to the About, click Sponsors, and you'll learn all about them. There's also details there about how you could support the podcast or become a sponsor yourself. And if you don't want to sponsor, but you still want to support the podcast, then please, please, please leave a review. It goes a really long way in terms of helping people to find the podcast. And it's just really nice to be able to get those reviews and hear from you guys. My favorite place to collect them and listen and read them is on Podchaser. So if you head over there and leave a review, I would be most grateful. Okay, enough yammering from me, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for constantly connecting in with the Animal Turn. I am humbled and amazed at the extent to which you join in and listen to this podcast, and it really is a joy doing this for you. So have a wonderful day wherever you are. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Hurtenfelder.
For more great iROAR podcasts, visit iROARpod.com. That's iROARpod.com.